Yeah, okay, בסדר, good. So I want to, so yeah, yesterday we diverged a bit, but not really diverged into some agriculture and permaculture. And I think we'll hopefully go back to some more of that later on. But I wanted us to continue working on this. And I thought it would be good if we read pages 14 and 15 and ask ourselves some questions about this. And then maybe kind of see how we tie this in with gardening and climate grief. We'll see what we have time to do. So yeah, did any of you have an opportunity to read any of the chat pages from the book?
I briefly read over them this afternoon before making dinner. So
okay. Yeah, so let's just you know what, I'll open the texts. Bear with me 1 second, please. I'll just open the texts here so we have them. Where did they go? Okay, so we're talking about Leviticus 26, verse 2 to 6. Okay, Leviticus 20. I love how so much of this is coming out of Leviticus. Okay. No, this is not Leviticus 26. Can't hear. Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah. Things are not where they're usually at today. Here. Okay. Yes. Verse 2. And now I'll add the English. Boom.
Cool.
So, would somebody like to read from verse 2 to verse 6 and then verse 12 and 13?
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
You shall keep my Sabbaths and venerate my sanctuary, mine, the Lord's. If you follow my laws and faithfully observe my commandments, I will grant your rains in their season, so that the earth shall yield its produce, and the trees of the field their fruit. Your threshing shall overtake the vintage, and your vintage shall overtake the sowing. You shall eat your fill of bread and dwell securely in your land. I will grant peace in the land, and you shall lie down untroubled by anyone. I will give the land respite from vicious beasts, and no sword shall cross your land.
Okay, and then verse 12 and 13.
I will be ever present in your midst. I will be your God, and you shall be my people. I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out from the land of the Egyptians to be their slaves no more, who broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going back into our source book. So what is this blessing about? What's happening with this blessing?
it's basically saying, like, if you follow my laws, the land will be fruitful, pretty much. Like, you'll have produce, you'll be secure, you'll be able to have bread, and you'll have a home, you'll have food.
Okay. Any other thoughts on the blessing that appears here? Thanks, Miranda. Anything else that comes up for the blessing?
I kind of had the thought of the last verse that last line in the last verse, "You broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect." I was kind of thinking, like, that specific wording of it, for some reason in my mind, associated almost like it's coming out of slavery, but it's also like that walking from the animal kingdom into the human kingdom. Like there's that being bipedal that's unique to humanity. I had that association for some reason, the way it was worded.
And
So
then
like
where does that take you? What does that tell you about humanity?
It makes me think like to not be slaves and to not be animals. It's a different kind of freedom, and it feels like there's a responsibility with that freedom, almost because of the need for self-mastery, I guess. Like there's a strong responsibility that comes with that, that walking upright ideology. I think that's where it takes me.
That's the leaving of Gan Eden, the leaving of the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
It's the entering adolescence or maybe adulthood.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interesting, like you're bringing that as an upright position, and thinking of Adam and Chava going out of Gan Eden, and they are in the upright position now. They're adults. They're something in them is broken, maybe, but something about them is not childlike.
Yeah.
Thinking about the punishment that Adonai gave to the snake of not being able to be upright. Although some snakes are able to do this, right? They're defying God. Well, they are generally, yeah.
Yeah.
They're pretty cool, yeah. So it kind of, yeah, it echoes this in a sense, but it removes us more from the earth, like we're more removed from the earth than we were before. Any other thoughts on the blessing itself, on wording from the blessing that you saw? What does this blessing mean? I was kind of intrigued by something they wrote here in the booklet, and I'll read it just so, unless you all have it with you, but why do you think the text mentions Shabbat in the plural, Shabtotai? Can the full impact and potential of Shabbat only be felt if the Shabbat, Shemitah, and Yovel cycles are celebrated together? Like you can't take the Shabbat as an individual occurrence. Like the impact of Shabbat happens when you celebrate all the Shabbatot. You don't miss a Shabbat. The impact of Shabbat is even greater when you celebrate it with Shemitah, and even greater when you celebrate it with Yovel. So I was just interested in this idea of the impact of the ongoing practice of non-ownership or non-creation. That it's not enough. The fact that we've only been doing Shabbat will bring us to only halfway. And we're not even doing Shabbat properly, I'm assuming, most of us. I'll talk about myself. And then to gain a bigger impact, we need to actually be able to go into Shemitah and Yovel also. So that was something that was interesting for me.
Like putting Shabbat in the plural, it gives us an idea that we're supposed to be more aware of the cycles of the earth and the cycles of time itself, and could cause us to pause a little bit of like, as we're reading this and being like, okay, it's in the plural. Why is it in the plural when we refer to Shabbat in the singular on a weekly occurrence? Kind of idea.
Wait, Miranda, you were cut off for me at least at some of the points. So can you just? I don't know if for others you were also cut off, but for me a bit. So maybe you can just repeat a bit of it.
So like with having Shabbat in the plural in the text, kind of makes us more aware of the cycles of time, nature, things like that. But it also causes us to pause at the same time. Like, why do we refer to it singularly on a weekly way when the text has it in the plural kind of thing? Kind of makes us think about the juxtaposition of our thought process and contradictions in there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the blessing that they're giving us here, that we are given here as humans, is a blessing of, if we manage to accumulate this practice, if we manage to be persistent in the practice and to return to it every cycle. Also, the blessing will not manifest if I do 1 or 10 Shabbatot, or if I do 1 Shemitah, apparently, or maybe. The blessing will only manifest if we go into a practice of being in this very big cycle and continuing to be in it. So, like when I'm thinking of it from a Jewish perspective, like we don't have Shemitah even before maybe the destruction and the diaspora, but for sure after the destruction of the diaspora, and it's sort of returned now. But maybe it's the other way around. Maybe we have this destruction, ongoing destruction and diaspora, because we're not actually in this cycle of blessing that brings with it Shemitah and Yovel. And now that we're taking upon ourselves as a nation to go back, regardless of if we're living on the land of Israel or not, going into observing Shemitah and Yovel in the ways that we can, together with Shabbat, we might kind of regain the blessing of being grounded again. Again, I'm not talking geography here, I'm talking grounded in the world. Yeah, which is a blessing.
And I think it's important for us to be in those bigger cycles in order to be grounded in the world, because we see things in our own time frame, and our time frame is like a blink compared to the time frame of the world, like geological time, right? So it's important to be grounded in those different cycles. So like even though we're aware of our weekly cycles, and that's like kind of where we sit and like think like week to week, and maybe automatically, like maybe at the most, if you're not being intentional, month to month. But if you're being intentional, you can get more grounded in some of those larger cycles that the earth is grounded in as well. I think that's important.
Okay, so now we flip, and now we go into the onto page 15, and we're gonna read what happens when we don't do it. So it's the flip side. Okay, 1 second, I just need to close the door here. Okay, so this is from Leviticus 26, verses 18 to 20. And then verses 34 to 35. So would somebody like to read verses 18 to 20?
I can do it. And if for all that you do not obey me, I will go on to discipline you sevenfold for your sins, and I will break your proud glory. I will make your skies like iron and your earth like copper, so that your strength shall be spent to no purpose. Your land shall not yield its produce, nor shall the trees of the land yield their fruit.
Okay, then I'm just moving quickly to verse 34. Ken, b'kasha.
Then shall the land make up for its Sabbath years throughout the time that it is desolate, and you are in the land of your enemies. then shall the land rest and make up for its Sabbath years. Throughout the time it is desolate, it shall observe the rest that it did not observe in your Sabbath years while you were dwelling upon it.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. So they brought in here the concepts of consequence and punishment. And before that, we had reward and consequence. Like what we're seeing here in both of these pieces of the chapter, are we seeing a reward or a punishment for our actions or a consequence to our actions? And I thought that's an interesting kind of question. What's happening here? Like, where do these two concepts take us? Consequence or the other ones?
I'm seeing more consequences if your actions don't line up with obeying the law. So like, you obey the law, everything's good. And then consequences if you don't, here's everything that will happen. That's what I'm saying.
So it's built into the system.
Yeah.
When I first heard it, immediately I thought it was punishment. But after near the end here, it really does sound like a consequence to me. But initially I thought it was punishment.
So what makes you think about consequence here? Where does the consequence come in? Like, what made you change your mind?
Well, just the fact that in the beginning it sounds very much like a punishment immediately, and then just by reading everything, it really sounds like, no, this in fact, if you're not following the laws, then this in fact will be your consequence. It's just as we're reading through it, it just really changed my mind. So let's see where exactly. Throughout the time that it is desolate, it shall observe the rest that it did not observe in your Sabbath years while you were dwelling upon it. That just seems to me like very consequential.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then what does it make us, like, where does it put us as humans when it's a consequence and not a punishment?
It makes us very accountable.
And like, I'm thinking, I'd like to unpack this a bit because, I mean, this is part of the discussion. I think this is where sometimes climate change discussion or the climate catastrophe or whatever we want to call it, that's where sometimes I'm not sure where we're going with it, with our conversation about it as a society. And this question of, is the earth punishing us, or is it just, this is what we did and this is what we're reaping now, right? So, so that's why I think it's a very relevant question. Like, is the situation now a punishment or a consequence? And if it, wherever we're going with this answer, how does it make us act differently as a response? Like, how do we respond differently?
So to me, climate change and the climate crisis that we're in is very much more a consequence of our previous actions. So if you look at the Industrial Revolution and the built-up industrialization of civilization and the increased use of resources that spew off carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and that's the consequence of our industrialization and not really stopping and pausing and thinking about what are we doing to our planet, because we have no place to go. We have not even figured out interstellar travel, so we have to figure out how to live on this planet, and it's our responsibility to say, whoa, we need to put the brakes on because we got nowhere to go. And if we keep going forward like we are, it's probably going to be 2030. It might be 50 years before the earth is, it's going to be the consequences of climate change is going to be too severe. It might be sooner than that if we don't put the brakes on quickly enough in the next 10 years. But it puts a lot of the responsibility of this current climate crisis on us, of us looking back at why didn't we not invest sooner? why did we not do more to put the brakes on faster? What can we do to encourage the more industrialized countries to cut their carbon emissions and then help countries that are starting to industrialize find ways of industrializing responsibly, more on the sustainable side than on the less sustainable side, resource heavy, using more like water, wind, solar for industrialization rather than coal, oil, things, resources of that nature for industrialization. So that's what we really need to do. And that's my opinion because I want to go into endangered species conservation, and this is kind of a big button topic for me. Like,
Sure.
I see it
Yeah,
as more of the
for sure.
consequences of what we did.
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks, Miranda. Yeah, that's a. So any other thoughts from different perspectives, maybe? On what the difference is between being in a stance of blame to a stance of consequence.
I guess I'm thinking of it from a parenting point of view, but if it's a natural consequence, it's when you give a warning and you tell what's going to happen, and then eventually there reaches a tipping point where somebody gets hurt or something happens, and then that there is a natural consequence rather than a punishment where you don't necessarily learn something from it. You should learn from the consequence, and then next time you can see it coming, you can plan how you're going to act differently. So to me, the whole like climate change seems very biblical in its scope. We've had warnings, we know what's happening, we know what's coming, we could change our ways, and then eventually it's going to get to a tipping point where the consequences, we're just going to have to live with it or not be able to live with it.
Yeah, I'm thinking of when you brought in the parenting thing. And it's a tricky thing, right? Well, at least for me, to be able to say this is the consequence and this is not a punishment. Like it's it's sometimes difficult for me, at least, to be able to kind of word it in a way that makes it seem like that. But I think that sometimes when we create a scenario where this is the consequence and it's not a reward or a punishment, then in a sense it takes out some of the ego of the individuals involved. So it's not about you, right? We're not that amazing or that evil. It's just, this is the world. This is how it works. You're part of it. So maybe using a consequence-based language might take away maybe some of the ego aspects of, because the flip side of punishment is reward. And that also can sometimes bring us to places that might not be spiritually beneficial, I think. If we think, oh, we have this, amazing rainy season, it's because we've been so good. I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just understanding that it's not a virtue to be aligned with nature. It's just what we should be doing. Does that make sense? Like, does that fit in any way? Yeah. Okay, right.
With the whole reward punishment aspect, as soon as we start thinking about climate crisis or anything like that as like a punishment for things, and we all start changing our ways, people will start slacking off again, kind of thing. So I'm pulling out COVID-19 in this. So like we did so good with all the restrictions. Now people are like, okay, now I can go out and party as a reward for this kind of thing. And now we're seeing a spike in cases. And it's like, no, you can't think of it that way.
Right.
So that's probably a poor thing to pull out right now.
No, that makes sense
That's
as an
where
example,
my
though.
brain is with Edmonton cases spiking.
Spiking, no, that makes perfect sense as an
I can
as
kind of
a
figure out, like,
parallel.
why is it going, that's happening?
Because that's how microbes work. Like, it's not reward and punishment, it's how microbes work.
Hmm.
I
So that is a
understand
good
how
point.
microbes
Yeah.
work. It's just more of like, guys, when did we start slacking off?
When we decided that we deserved the reward because we were good, instead of looking at it as that's how microbes work.
Yeah. So it's in the small picture and also probably in the big picture,
Yeah.
and then maybe it's easier if you're in this large cycle and you keep reminding yourself every week, every year, every 50 years, there is a cycle and we need to be part of this clockwork. Then you're already inside the clockwork. You're kind of, you understand maybe how it works. Maybe you don't. Maybe you lose sight of it also. It's like, I feel like I need to think about this more, but the structure they're creating here and the Torah is creating here, and the question of how do we become realigned without, reward and punishment, but really just realigned, is a big question for me. Okay, so any other thoughts about this prophecy of warning or anything else that comes up for you?
I think I'm just like, the thing that's coming up is that I think it starts with seeing the consequences. Because I think I just like playing off of that idea of seeing it like that kind of takes ego out of the picture. Like, I think when we're capable of doing that and not making it so much about it's kind of paradoxical, but it's like when we make it a little bit less about us, then it's easier to take responsibility for ourselves, if that makes sense, right? Like, so it's easy. So again, like, if you're, yeah, I'm having a hard time articulating it because it seems like such a paradoxical thought, but with consequence, if you're seeing the consequence, it helps you distance from it as being something of you, and then you can take responsibility for your part in the bigger picture that connects to that consequence. I don't know if that's
No, I think it makes sense. I don't think it's paradoxical because
okay.
once you distance yourself and you say, this isn't about me, okay, we are not the center of the picture.
No.
There's a different center.
Yeah.
Right? So once I realize there is a different center and I'm in relation with that other center, then I might develop a form of responsibility, maybe. Okay. I made a jump here. Okay, so I need to figure out how to connect the jump.
That's how I felt like what was going on in my head too.
No, but I mean the movement itself makes sense. So
yeah.
When we begin the Shemona Esrei, when we begin the Amidah, the Tefillah, right? So we take 3 steps back and then 3 steps forward, and then we begin the prayer, right? So the whole idea of taking 3 steps back and forward, as I once heard, is that at that moment you're going back and forth. So this is the center. You're moving in relation to the center. There's a different center for the world. I am not the center.
No.
Okay. So in a sense, that's what it's supposed to remind me. So when I'm saying, it's not about you, it's not about your reward and punishment, doesn't mean I'm insignificant. It just means I'm not the center. Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. So this is the theology we're trying to develop here, right? Okay. So we'll try. But then, okay, So going backwards and forwards, I'm realizing I'm not the center and there's something else that is immovable. So it's my responsibility, or it's upon me to realize where the center is and not bang into it and ruin it.
But if you can bang into it and ruin it, then it's movable.
Yeah, or at least
Depends on
breakable.
the structure. I play
Huh?
way too much D&D, so it really depends on the structure and your strength score. If you have a strength of like 10, which is a +0 in D&D terms, and that's basically average-ish,
Uh-huh.
you run into an object that is a brick wall, you're going to probably knock yourself out more than you're going to do damage to the brick wall.
That's
But
accurate.
But if you have a strength of like 16 or 17, which is +3 and above average,
Maybe a couple weapon
might be
hacks
able
added
to-
on.
do damage more to the brick wall than to yourself, okay? So, again, it really depends on the structure as to how immovable it is and your strength score.
So humanity
All
probably needs
the
to
nerdy stuff.
realize.
Sorry, guys.
No, so that's a really good explanation, Rand, actually. But
I
then
like
humanity
that.
needs to realize that we are not as individuals, but as a group, we're a force of nature, right?
Yeah,
like
we have a higher strength score than we're giving ourselves credit for.
yeah, it still doesn't mean that we can create the map of the game. Like, we're still not the structure of the game. We just have as much power, like we have as a group, we have power like a volcano or many volcanoes or like any other force of nature, but we're still within nature. So we can, with our joint efforts, we can move something in the structure, but it's still not, but it's still, we're still part of the structure.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, and then the other thing with the Amida and the stepping forward and backwards, it gives us a moment to pause and remind ourselves that we are not the center. That the center is somewhere else, like the earth or whatever else that we would want to think of as the center is the center. We're just a part of it. We can move in relation to it. We can think outside of what is considered the center. But we ourselves are not. So it gives that moment for us to pause and think about that and remind ourselves of that.
Yeah. And then, okay, good. Okay, so now, when I was reading this then, and the reason I brought in climate grief, and it's the thing that brought that to me is these two words, these three words, Vatem be'eretz oivechem. And you are in the land of your enemies. You are in the land of your enemies. I was thinking, what does that mean? What does that mean to us spiritually? So it's the galut, right? It's a galut, it's a diaspora, but what does it mean spiritually and emotionally? And especially now that we're talking about the fact that we are part of the structure and we're realizing we've moved the structure or kind of moved something, shaken something in the structure. So what is climate grief about in this sense? What is this call that's happening in us?
I would say it's kind of waking ourselves up to the role that we as an individual may have had in climate change and coming to grips with that. And trying to move from coming to grips with a possible role to more action, kind of that movement. And
But grief is the moment before action. Grief is the pause. It's in a sense, it's the Shabbat before the action. It's the Shmita before the action. Like when we sit Shiva, right? Again, 7, hello, that appears again. So when we sit Shiva after death, when we're in grief, when we're in mourning, like within this time again, we are in non-action, actually. So what is this climate grief, if it is a spiritual tool, and I think it is, what does it allow us to do if we're talking from, and kind of as a group we've decided today that we're talking about it from a consequence perspective. So what does climate grief help us with? If it helps us.
I think it does give you some time to have that pause and kind of think back to all the possible wrongdoings that you have done towards Earth. And to me, the land of your enemies is just the thought process of the guilt that you feel over not doing what you should have been doing and taking care of the land and the earth like you should be doing. That's kind of my thought.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so it's kind of going over what we've done. It's rethinking where we are.
Reflection.
Reflection, okay. Reflection. Any other thoughts on what climate grief might give us? Or action, like, or practice from within climate grief, or within acknowledging it?
I don't think you can reconcile if you can't feel the grief.
Can you say that again?
I don't think that you can reconcile if you can't feel the grief.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that I honestly feel like we need a collective climate grief in order to reconcile the wrongs that have happened.
Yeah.
So it needs to go deeper than the individual in order for those wrongs to be righted, because we have very little time for that window of opportunity.
Yeah, it's not 10 years, it's more like a year, if I remember. Yeah. And I'm thinking back on the idea that we are a force of nature as a group, as a collective, and perhaps the grief has to be in a very large group setting for it to kind of impact us as a force.
Yeah.
There was an article I read, and we need to finish soon, but we need to end soon. But there was an article I read a few months ago on the Anthropocene. But from a perspective, I need to go back and read it and I'll share it with you. But she was actually, it was from a philosophical perspective. And what she was saying was Anthropocene is not necessarily essentially a bad thing. It's a reality because we are a force, because we are impactful. Like any other part of nature, we are part of it. And we have this great impact because of who we are as a species. The question is not like, it's not about eradicating Anthropocene, it's being mindful in this situation. And I just thought that was a really interesting perspective because whenever I've been reading about Anthropocene, it was more like, this is an evil. And she was like, no, it's not an evil. It's a reality that we need to acknowledge and then work from within, which I thought, much like this idea of consequence, took away the ethical labels of the situation and said more, okay, so now how do we deal with it? So I'll look for it.
I'd love to read that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm really on the fence as to whether good and evil are helpful terms at all. Because I think that and I'm not saying that there isn't right action and wrong action, like that's not what I'm saying at all. But I think that having a label of good or having a label of evil, it paints a whole picture and it doesn't really allow for the details, for the shades of gray, for the individual stories within it, it's a very broad stroke, I guess.
I'm gonna pull out another D&D Dungeons and Dragons thing. There's a concept called alignment.
Uh-huh.
And in the alignment chart for Dungeons and Dragons, there are 9 possible alignments.
Mm-hmm.
3 are good, 3 are evil, 3 are neutral.
Yep.
Now, there's lawful good, neutral good, and chaotic good. So those are the good alignments. They reflect back on the evil side and the neutral ones. So lawful neutral, true neutral, chaotic neutral. Chaotic evil, neutral evil, and lawful evil. Each of them have their set of traits that line up for each of the alignments, and you basically play a character based on that. I keep on telling people that I'm chaotic good or true lawful neutral, because those are the 2 alignments when you look at the full chart and how it cycles through that I switch back and forth between. So I think that general concept from Dungeons and Dragons really helps explain why it's really hard to label something straightforwardly good or straightforwardly evil. There are a lot of shades of gray in life. And that's where the neutral alignments kind of help with the complexities of life. And I've geeked out and nerded out on you guys way too much tonight.
Yeah, it's all good. I play D&D twice a week, Miranda.
Pulled out tonight that makes sense with what we were talking about.
Again, it brings back good memories from like
Nice.
too many years ago. I will not say how many years. It's very
My
embarrassing.
life is basically Dungeons and Dragons, temple, church, and art right now, so it's fine.
Okay,
You
so
keep making those analogies, Miranda.
okay, wait. So we had many things happening today with our thoughts. We went in many directions. I hope this was recorded as it should have been, and then if you want, you can go back, and I'll look to send you that article. What I would like to suggest on page 16, there's an etymology of the 7th year, and on page 17, there's some questions. So what I thought, if you have time till next week, when you're not playing Dungeons and Dragons, okay? So perhaps choose one question, and I know everyone's busy, but if you have time to choose one question, and try doing some work around it. Like it doesn't have to be an article, just like, free write about it or draw or paint or whatever, bring any associations, but try and explore one of the questions just to close this chapter, because we finished one chapter now, okay? And then we can share it next time as a way of kind of closing this chapter and seeing what we took from it. And then we'll go on. And so the next chapter is recalling ancient memory. It's Shemitah in early Israel and temple periods. So we're going to leave the Torah and go into some ancient history on it. So, yeah. Okay, thank you.